Imagine standing in a boxing ring, 30 seconds before the biggest fight of your life. Your heart is pounding so hard you can feel it in your throat. The crowd is roaring your name, thousands of voices blending into one deafening wave of sound. Camera flashes are popping like lightning all around you. And somewhere in the back of your mind, underneath all that noise, you remember a boy who once woke up before sunrise to work in a coal yard, just so his family could have something to eat that night. That boy grew up to stand toe-to-toe with legends. That boy was called a bum by people who never lived a single day of his struggle. And that boy became one of the most feared, most dominant heavyweight champions who ever lived. This is not just a story about boxing. This is a story about survival, about hunger, about a man who refused to let poverty write the ending of his life. This is the story of Larry Holmes. Before the world knew his name, before the championship belts, before the money and the fame and the magazine covers, there was just a scared, hungry kid in rural Georgia, born into a family so large and so poor that some nights, dinner simply didn't happen. Larry Holmes came into this world on November 3, 1949, in the small town of Cuthbert, Georgia. He was the fourth of 12 children. 12. Sit with that number for a second. 12 mouths to feed. 12 bodies to clothe. 12 futures resting on the shoulders of two exhausted parents trying to make something out of nothing in the segregated South, in a place and a time where opportunities for black families were scarce, and survival itself was often the only goal anyone could afford to have. Life in Cuthbert was hard in ways that are difficult for most people today to even picture. The Holmes family worked the land, they scraped by, they made do with what little they had, and they leaned on each other because leaning on anyone else simply wasn't an option. When Larry was still a boy, his family packed up what little they had and moved north, chasing the same dream so many black families chased in that era, the dream of factory jobs, the dream of a better life away from the fields of Georgia, the dream of finally being able to breathe a little easier. They landed in Easton, Pennsylvania, a gritty, blue-collar industrial town that would later give Larry his famous nickname, the Easton Assassin. But better didn't come easy. Even in the North, poverty followed the Holmes family like a shadow that refused to let go, creeping into every corner of their new life the same way it had haunted their old one. Then came the moment that would shatter what little stability the family still had. Larry's father walked out. Just like that, the man who was supposed to be the foundation of the household, the provider, the protector, was gone. And the weight of an entire family shifted violently onto the back of a mother who refused to let her children starve, and onto the shoulders of children who had to grow up faster than any child should ever have to. Larry was one of them. He was still just a boy, still supposed to be worrying about schoolyard games and childhood dreams, but boyhood was a luxury his family could no longer afford. Innocence doesn't survive long in a house where the next meal is never guaranteed. By the time he was 13 years old, most kids were worrying about homework, about report cards, about which friends they'd sit with at lunch. Larry Holmes was worrying about survival. He dropped out of school in the 7th grade. Read that again, because it matters. 7th grade, not because he didn't want an education, not because he lacked intelligence or curiosity, but because his family needed him to work, and work he did, without complaint, without hesitation, because that's simply what love looked like in the Holmes household. He took jobs most grown men would complain about today. He shined shoes on cold street corners for pocket change, kneeling in front of strangers, hustling for coins. He worked in car washes, scrubbing vehicle after vehicle for hours in freezing temperatures, his hands raw and cracked from the cold water. And most grueling of all, he worked at a coal yard, hauling heavy loads day after day, shovel after shovel, building a body that would later terrify grown men twice his size in the ring, and building a will that no amount of hardship could ever fully break. There was no glamour in any of it. There was no reporter following him around, predicting greatness, no scout whispering that this kid was destined for something bigger. There was just a boy doing whatever it took to help his mother put food on the table for 11 brothers and sisters. And if you really think about it, that coal yard, that car wash, those long, back-breaking hours under a boss who didn't care how tired his body was, they were the real training camp, long before the real training camp ever came. They built something inside Larry Holmes that no coach, no trainer, no gym in the world could ever install. They built desperation. They built discipline forged in exhaustion. They built hunger. And in boxing, real hunger, the kind that comes from knowing what it feels like to go without, is often the difference between a good fighter and a truly great one. Boxing found Larry almost by accident, the way it finds so many kids from tough neighborhoods, as an outlet, a place to release the frustration of a childhood stolen too early, and maybe, just maybe, a way out of the poverty that had defined every single day of his young life. He wasn't a golden boy amateur with flashy credentials and trophies lining a shelf. He was raw. He was rough around the edges, still learning the fundamentals, while other young fighters were already polished. But he had one gift that simply cannot be taught in any gym, no matter how expensive the coaching. He had an incredible whip-fast jab, a punch that would eventually be studied, analyzed, and called one of the greatest in heavyweight boxing history. In the early 1970s, Larry got an opportunity that would quietly change the entire trajectory of his life, though at the time, it probably felt more like grunt work than destiny knocking at his door. He became a sparring partner, not just for anybody. He shared the ring with some of the most dangerous, most skilled heavyweights on the entire planet, men whose names would echo through boxing history forever, men like Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, and Ken Norton. Picture that for a moment. Really picture it. A young, unproven, unknown fighter from Easton, Pennsylvania, stepping into the ring day after day, absorbing punishment from three of the greatest heavyweights to ever live, just so they could sharpen their skills for their next big fight, just so they could get paid a little extra, while he earned barely enough to scrape by. Most people would have broken under that pressure. Most people would have walked away after the first few sessions of getting hit, again and again, by Muhammad Ali, arguably the most gifted heavyweight of all time, a man whose hand speed and footwork redefined the sport. But Larry didn't break. He learned, he watched, closely, patiently, hungrily. He studied the way Ali moved around the ring like he owned it, the way he controlled distance with almost mathematical precision, the way he used his jab not just as a weapon, but as a conversation starter, setting up devastating combinations that followed. Larry absorbed all of it like a sponge, quietly building the blueprint for his own legendary career, while the entire world was busy watching somebody else, never suspecting that the sparring partner in the corner would one day rise to stand among the very legends he was learning from. He turned professional in 1973, and for the next several years, he built his record fight by fight, opponent by opponent, largely under the radar, largely unnoticed by a public, still fixated on bigger names. There was no overnight fame. There was no viral moment, because there was no such thing as viral back then. Just steady, patient, grinding work. The same kind of relentless work he'd learned as a teenager in that coal yard, showing up every single day whether he felt like it or not. Win after win started to pile up quietly, fight after fight, city after city, but the boxing world was still fixated on the golden era of Ali, Frazier, and Foreman, the larger-than-life figures dominating headlines and magazine covers. Larry Holmes was the guy waiting patiently in the wings, sharpening his jab in empty gyms, sharpening his patience in empty arenas, waiting for a moment that hadn't arrived yet, but that he never stopped believing would come. That moment finally arrived on June 9, 1978, and it remains, to this day, one of the most brutal, most respected fights in heavyweight boxing history. Larry Holmes stepped into the ring against Ken Norton for the vacant WBC Heavyweight Championship. 15 rounds. 15 grueling rounds of two elite heavyweights, refusing to back down, refusing to yield, trading punishment that would leave both men forever changed, both physically and in how the boxing world would remember them. The final round of that fight is still talked about today by historians and analysts. An all-out war where both fighters emptied everything they had left in their bodies, both of them knowing that a championship and a piece of history hung in the balance of every single punch thrown in those final desperate minutes. When the scorecards were read, Larry Holmes won by split decision. It was razor thin. It could have gone either way, and for years afterward, Boxing fans would debate that final round in barbershops and bars across the country. But it didn't go the other way. Larry Holmes, the boy who dropped out of school in 7th grade, the boy who hauled coal for pennies in the freezing cold, the boy who once absorbed punches from legends just so other men could become champions, was now, officially, undeniably, a heavyweight champion of the world himself. Somewhere in eastern Pennsylvania, a mother who had raised 12 children largely on her own must have felt something words can barely describe. You would think that victory would be the climax of the story, the emotional peak, the moment everything built toward. But in truth, it was only the beginning of an era. What followed was one of the most dominant championship reigns in heavyweight boxing history, a run so consistent, so relentless, that it deserves to be spoken about in the same breath as the greatest championship reigns in any sport. Larry Holmes didn't just win the title, he defended it again and again and again, against a murderer's row of hungry, dangerous contenders who all believed they could be the one to take his crown. He defended his heavyweight championship an astonishing 20 times. 20 times he walked into the ring as the man everyone wanted to dethrone, and 20 times he walked out still wearing the crown, his jab as sharp on defense number 20 as it had been on defense number 1. That kind of dominance put him in rare, almost mythical company, standing alongside the very legends whose sparring sessions once left him bruised and battered as a young man simply trying to survive another day. His jab became legendary in boxing circles, described by trainers and analysts as one of the best the sport has ever seen, a weapon so precise, so consistently effective, that opponents structured entire fight strategies just trying to survive it, just trying to find a way around it. Behind that jab was footwork, timing, and an almost scientific understanding of distance and range, all of it forged not in some elite training academy with the best equipment money could buy, but in the streets, in the car washes, and in the coal yards of a childhood that gave him no other choice but to be tough, to be sharp, to be efficient, with every single movement. But even at the height of his powers, even as one of the most dominant heavyweight champions the world had ever seen, Larry Holmes lived in a shadow that no amount of winning could fully erase. Not a shadow of failure, but a far more frustrating shadow, the shadow of comparison. He fought during an era still completely haunted by the legend of Muhammad Ali, whose charisma, whose poetry, whose larger-than-life personality had captured the entire world's imagination in a way few athletes ever have. And no matter how many times Holmes defended his title, no matter how dominant his reign became, no matter how technically brilliant his performances were night after night, a portion of the public and media never fully gave him the credit or the adoration he had rightfully earned. It's one of the cruelest, most bitter ironies in sports history. The man built one of the greatest championship reigns of all time and still had to fight for respect outside the ring almost as hard as he fought for it inside. A battle that no jab, no combination, no knockout could ever fully win. Then came 1985, and with it, the fight that would define Larry Holmes forever, for better and for worse. A single night that would shape how history remembered him for decades to come. He stood at 48 wins and 0 losses. 48-0, a record so pristine, so remarkable, that the entire boxing world was watching with bated breath. One more victory, just one, would tie him with the legendary Rocky Marciano's perfect 49-0 record, a mark that had stood untouched since the 1950s, considered by many to be one of the most unbreakable, most sacred records in all of sports. The entire boxing world watched as Larry Holmes stepped into the ring against a light heavyweight champion moving up in weight, a fighter named Michael Spinks, a smaller, faster man that many assumed Holmes would simply overwhelm. Nobody expected what happened next. Michael Spinks, using speed and unconventional, awkward angles that confused Holmes for much of the fight, pulled off one of the biggest upsets in heavyweight boxing history, winning by decision in front of a stunned crowd. Larry Holmes' dream of immortality, of matching Rocky Marciano's perfect record and cementing his name permanently among boxing's greatest untouchable achievements, was gone in an instant, snatched away after more than a decade of sacrifice, discipline, and dominance. What happened after that fight revealed something raw and painfully human about Larry Holmes, something the cameras rarely capture in polished, sanitized sports documentaries. In the heat of his heartbreak and frustration, standing in front of reporters with wounds still fresh, Holmes made comments about Rocky Marciano that were widely criticized, essentially suggesting that Marciano's undefeated record and legacy didn't deserve the level of reverence it received. The backlash was swift and severe. Sports writers, fans, and even fellow boxers turned on him almost overnight, painting him as bitter, as disrespectful, as ungrateful toward the game's history and its legends. The same man who had spent over a decade dominating the heavyweight division, defending his title 20 times, was suddenly being treated like a villain. But here's what so many people missed in that moment of outrage, what so many failed to understand as they rushed to condemn him. Those words didn't come from arrogance. They came from a place of deep, aching, unfiltered pain. This was a man who had clawed his way up from absolute nothing, who had sacrificed his entire childhood, who had taken punishment as a sparring partner just to survive another week, who had built one of the greatest championship reigns in boxing history through sheer relentless will, and who, in one single night, watched a lifetime of sacrifice slip through his fingers, just one win short of eternal glory. Grief makes people say things they don't fully mean, things they'll regret the moment the cameras turn off. And Larry Holmes, in that raw, unfiltered moment of devastation, was grieving something most people will never fully understand: the death of a dream he had chased since he was a boy, shining shoes on a street corner. He got a rematch against Spinks later that same year, hoping to right the wrong, hoping to reclaim what had been taken from him, but he lost again, this time by decision as well, closing the door on his perfect record chase for good, permanently, painfully. For most fighters, that kind of heartbreak, followed by such intense public backlash, would be the end of the story, the point where a man quietly fades away, bitter and broken. But Larry Holmes was never most fighters, and he was certainly never a man who knew how to quit. He stepped away from the ring for a few years, trying to process what had happened, trying to find peace with a record that would forever have an asterisk in his mind. But boxing, it seems, is rarely something a true fighter can walk away from completely, no matter how much heartbreak it has caused. In 1988, Holmes returned for one of the most anticipated fights of his comeback, stepping into the ring against a young, terrifying force of nature named Mike Tyson, who was tearing through the heavyweight division like a hurricane, knocking out opponent after opponent in devastating fashion. Holmes, well past his physical prime by boxing standards, was knocked out by Tyson in a tough, difficult loss, a passing of the torch moment that boxing fans still discuss and debate today, a symbolic changing of the guard between one era of heavyweight dominance and the next. And yet, incredibly, almost stubbornly, Larry Holmes kept fighting. He kept lacing up his gloves well into his 40s, a time when most heavyweight boxers have long since retired to broadcast booths, to coaching careers, or to quiet lives far away from the violence of the ring. In 1992, at 42 years old, an age most consider well past any athlete's prime, Holmes challenged Evander Holyfield for the heavyweight championship. He lost the decision, but he went the full 12 rounds against one of the most elite, most dangerous fighters of that entire era, proving to everyone watching that even in his 40s, that Easton toughness, that Coalyard resilience, had never once left him. What's truly remarkable, almost unbelievable when you actually say it out loud, is that Larry Holmes continued fighting professionally into his 50s. Think about that for a moment. Let it really sink in. A man who started working in coal yards as a child, who became heavyweight champion of the world in his 20s, was still competing at the highest levels of professional boxing decades later, when most men his age were simply trying to keep up with their grandchildren at family barbecues. His final professional record stood at an extraordinary 69 wins against just 6 losses, a testament to a career that spanned an almost unheard-of length of time in one of the most physically demanding, most unforgiving sports on earth, a career built on a foundation poured decades earlier in a Pennsylvania coal yard. But Larry Holmes' story was never only about what happened inside the ropes, never only about punches thrown and titles won and lost. Outside the ring, He built something arguably just as impressive as his boxing legacy, a genuine business empire, right there in the same town of Easton, Pennsylvania, that once knew him as a poor kid working odd jobs just to survive another winter. He opened restaurants that became local staples. He invested in real estate throughout his community. He became involved in banking ventures, putting his name and his money behind institutions that served the very neighborhoods that had raised him. The same discipline, the same patience, the same relentless work ethic that carried him through 15 brutal rounds against Ken Norton carried him through building an actual, lasting financial legacy for himself and his family, something so few champions from his era were ever able to accomplish, something that so many legendary boxers, despite their fame, tragically never managed to secure. He didn't just become a boxing legend, he became a respected businessman, a pillar of his community, proof that his story was never just about punches thrown and titles won, but about a boy who learned, early and painfully, how to build something out of nothing, and never forgot that lesson. His personal life, like so many parts of his journey, was built on the foundation of family, on the values instilled in him by a mother who refused to let poverty defeat her children. He married Diane Holmes, and together they raised children, with Larry working hard, consciously, deliberately, to give them a childhood far different from the one he had endured, one with stability, with resources, with a father who, unlike his own, remained present in their lives, who showed up, who didn't walk away when things got difficult. After everything he had survived, after everything the world had thrown at him, after the poverty and the sparring sessions and the public criticism, Larry Holmes made sure his own family would never know the kind of hunger and hardship he once knew as a boy in Georgia and Pennsylvania. That, in many ways, might be his quietest, most personal victory of all, one that never made headlines but mattered more than any of them. In 2008, decades after that split-decision victory over Ken Norton, decades after the controversy surrounding the Spinks fight, decades after the coal yard and the car washes and the sparring sessions that left him battered but unbroken, Larry Holmes was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame. It was more than just an award, more than a plaque on a wall. It was the boxing world finally, formally, undeniably acknowledging what should have been obvious all along, that Larry Holmes belonged among the greatest heavyweight champions to ever step into a ring, regardless of whose shadow he had fought under for so many years. There are things about Larry Holmes that even hardcore boxing fans often don't know. Small details buried beneath the headlines that reveal just how remarkable his journey truly was. Few people realize just how directly his early years sparring with Muhammad Ali shaped his own championship style, meaning that in a strange, almost poetic twist of fate, the very man who many unfairly compared him to for his entire career was also one of the people who quietly helped make him great in the first place. Few people talk about the fact that his 20 successful title defenses put him in a category of dominance shared by only a handful of heavyweight champions in the sport's entire history, a statistic that gets overshadowed far too often by the controversy of a single loss. And few people fully appreciate that a man who dropped out of school in the 7th grade due to poverty went on to become not just a world champion, but a savvy, successful businessman who built lasting generational wealth, at a time when so many boxers, even legendary, beloved ones, ended up broke, forgotten, and struggling long after their careers ended. So what does the legacy of Larry Holmes actually look like, when you step back and look at the entire picture, when you strip away the headlines and the controversies, and really examine the whole of a man's life? It's not just 20 title defenses. It's not just a 69-6 record. It's not just a Hall of Fame induction sitting on a shelf somewhere. It's the story of a boy from Cuthbert, Georgia, one of 12 children, abandoned by his father, forced to leave school before he was even a teenager, who worked coal yards and car washes just to help his mother survive another month, who took punches from legends as a paid sparring partner just to make ends meet, and who transformed all of that pain, all of that hunger, all of that hardship into one of the most dominant heavyweight championship reigns the sport of boxing has ever witnessed. He was criticized for words spoken in heartbreak, words that came from a place of genuine grief rather than genuine arrogance. He was underappreciated during an era dominated by the enormous shadow of Muhammad Ali, fighting for respect that never fully arrived while he was in his prime. He lost fights that mattered deeply to him, in front of the entire world, on nights he had trained for his entire life. But he never stopped getting back up. He never stopped working, whether it was in the ring, in the gym, or in the boardrooms of the businesses he built. And in the end, he didn't just become a champion in the ring, he became a champion in life, building a business empire from nothing, raising a family with the love and stability he never had, and proving, beyond any doubt, that where you start in this world, no matter how hard, no matter how poor, no matter how broken your beginning might look, does not have to determine where you finish. Larry Holmes' story is a powerful reminder that greatness rarely comes wrapped in glamour, that it rarely announces itself with fanfare or fireworks. Sometimes it starts in a coal yard, covered in dust, exhausted, unseen by anyone who matters. Sometimes it starts with a boy who had every single reason to give up, every excuse the world could offer him, and simply refused to. If there's one thing his life teaches us, one lesson that echoes far beyond the world of boxing, it's that the hardest struggles of our lives, the ones that feel unbearable and endless in the moment, can become the very foundation of our greatest triumphs, if we're willing to keep getting back up, fight after fight, round after round, day after day, no matter how many times we get knocked down. If this story moved you, if watching Larry Holmes rise from poverty to become one of the greatest heavyweight champions in history reminded you that your own struggles could be building something powerful inside you too, something you can't even see yet, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because there are so many more incredible true stories just like this one waiting for you. Drop a comment below and tell us which part of Larry Holmes' journey hit you the hardest, whether it was the coal yard, the sparring sessions with Ali, the heartbreak against Spinks, or the quiet triumph of the businesses he built afterward. And share this video with someone who needs to hear today that it's never too late, and you're never too broken, to become a champion in your own story.